Hey there, this is Ari Witten, and welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I am here today with a very special guest, one of my favorite people in the world and one of the smartest people I know, Dr. Maya Shetreat-Klein. And she is a pediatric neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, naturalist, and author of The Dirt Cure, which I highly recommend, by the way. She's also been on the podcast before, so you guys might remember her. So in addition, she's also a mitochondriac, a fellow mitochondriac like me, and she does awesome work. So it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast again.
Thank you so much. I feel like you and I are the people that find each other at a party and sit and talk about nerdy science things.
For sure, yes, yeah, and I think we did actually. I think we've done that on a couple occasions now. So, on the last podcast, we talked a lot about the Dirt Cure. We talked about things related to the gut, the microbiome, to mitochondria, things like that. On this podcast, I invited you on and I want to discuss something a little bit different and something I've never really discussed before for some, kind of fears and things like that we'll get into later in this podcast. But I want to talk to you about the relationship of humans with nature. I want to talk to you about indigenous cultures. I want to talk to you about spirituality. I want to talk to you about plant medicine. So I want to talk to you about all kinds of cool stuff that I personally am a huge fan of and that I love talking about, but I haven't really broached these topics before. So with that said, let's get into it. So I know that you are very much in tune with indigenous cultures, and a lot of your paradigms have been influenced by your time that you spent in various indigenous cultures. So I'd love if you could just talk a little about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in my own family, my family is from, on my dad's side is from Morocco, and not very far back, like my grandmother, got married when she was 9 years old and had her first baby when she was 13. And they were kind of just coming out of a nomadic kind of life, So I think from my family had a lot of, kind of connection to sort of a much more, we call it primitive, but, it's, other people might call it, more grounded or more rooted. It's just a different approach to life. And as I progressed in my own awakening as a physician much later on, I ended up getting really called, I would almost say, to a trip to Ecuador, where I began to study with my teacher, who's a fourth generation shaman and also a PhD in ethnobotany. She's actually very accomplished in the academic world, but also comes from this background that's very spiritual and very experiential. And she's, a very fascinating person. And so I went on this trip with a bunch of people, and we began I began kind of a very deep study at that time of the different approaches of indigenous groups, in particular the Quechua and Warani people. But there are so many, and so it's been an amazing journey to learn from these different teachers.
Beautiful. Yeah. So to get into some more specifics, in what ways do you feel they've kind of influenced your approach to health? I mean, you're kind of walking in two worlds and it's very unusual for an MD to be kind of, you're grounded in this very conventional medicine sort of education. And then at the same time, you're also walking in these worlds that are totally foreign to conventional medicine and that they don't dabble in, they don't spend any time educating on, and most MDs really have no awareness of, that these things even exist, or they might brush them off as nonsense if they encounter them. So how have those two kind of paradigms and educations, how have they blended, and what specific learning you taken from those indigenous cultures that have influenced your practice?
Well, I'll tell you for a moment, I think about how what kind of opened me up to it, I think in the most profound way. And then that might kind of tell you a little bit, then I'll be able to tell you better, I think, what I've taken away.
Yeah, please.
The story of my book, The Dirt Cure, kind of all began with my son, who is a very, very amazing spiritual teacher, as children often are, but he's particularly so. And in the beginning of my medical training, I actually had, my son, and he was sick, and, I learned how food really was influencing his health, was affecting his asthma and his neurologic development and all these different things, and kind of went into this world of food and where it comes from, and ended up writing about the Dirt Cure. And after that, I really felt like I knew a lot about integrative medicine, and I knew a lot about food and nutrition and herbs, and I'd, done training. I was teaching a lot, and I really found all these different kind of, I feel like I had a lot of hubris at that time, because I thought anyone who has a problem, like, I can help that person. I know different things that are going to be able to help that person. And then, it turned out that we had mold actually in our apartment in New York City. And we had to leave and have a whole mold remediation for 5 months because my son was, again, very sick. And then when we moved back in, there was no mold. It had been gutted. Everything was clean. It was like, okay, we're starting fresh. And I went to take a shower. Ooh, I'm having like a little light spirit behind me there.
Yeah.
No,
I think it might be your aura.
Yeah, it's just the sun. But yeah, so he went to take a shower one day and he had a seizure getting into the shower. And obviously, as a pediatric neurologist, it was a really profound moment for me. I was afraid, as I think most people are when, someone's having a seizure. I was worried. And I also knew suddenly in that moment, with literally everything in me, that with everything I knew, and I think I knew probably more than any other pediatric neurologist in the world, maybe, or among the very few who knew and walked in these different worlds, I knew I didn't have the tools that I needed to help him. That his problem was not something I was going to be able to address physically, or just, with diet and things. I'd done all those things and he'd been doing really well, but as he always has, he was taking me kind of into a new world and onto a new journey. And that was when I kind of ended up finding this teacher who was lecturing at a conference in the United States, and ended up being drawn into this new way of looking at health, so that kind of brings me to, what kind of things did I learn? And one of the main things, I would say the primary things even that I learned, was in a lot of these different, like, there's just a completely different paradigm among indigenous healers, which is that we have a physical body, an emotional body, and a spiritual body. And actually physical health is probably the most downstream of all of them. So they say, if you're healthy, that means you're in good relations with yourself. You're in good relations with the people around you, your community, and you're in good relations with your place, like the terrain where you live, right? You're in good relations in those three ways. That is going to mean that you're not going to have health problems, emotional problems. All of those things are going to be okay. And, we think of all these things in a very fragmented way, if we even think of them at all. We talk about stress, and stress is sort of something we can talk about and feel okay to talk about. We could talk about like depression, or we have like a few names for these different non-physical states,
Neurotransmitter imbalance.
Right. Or Prozac deficiency.
Yes, exactly.
It's not funny, but it's such a different way of thinking about it. So physical, like, disease is something that's like the tip of the iceberg. Like, you've already been sick for a very long time, and like kind of the medicine people I've spoken to, you've been sick for a long time before you ever get physically sick. Mm. And that was helpful to me as a healer in so many ways, because I mean, I see in my practice, and I suspect that a lot of the people that you're working with and in your audience as well, I used to always call them little shamans. Like I see these children, let's say with autism, you know, and not just them. I mean, you know, all the different kinds of neurologic conditions, kids with seizures, you know, kids with ADD, like these kids are like, they have these like special antennae where they feel the world in a way that a lot of other people don't. And it's a gift. I think it's a gift to be sensitive in that way. It's just that our world, our culture, our society doesn't know what to do with these people who are these very sensitive people to all these different, yes, chemicals, yes, stressors, yes, the bad diet. I mean, all those things, but there's more, right? Like they're a lot of and I would even say, you know, maybe we on a certain level feel things in a way that maybe other people don't, or other people just shut out.
Yeah, fascinating. So these three bodies, you said spiritual, emotional, physical, right? Yeah. So as you were just alluding to, you know, kind of most of the discussion we hear is really around the physical body, or maybe the emotional body. I mean, they don't maybe use that language, but you know, we have clinical psychologists and psychiatrists that you could maybe say that they're addressing the emotional body. But what about this spiritual body? I mean, is that the most upstream of all of these? And what kinds of things influence the spiritual body?
I would say it is, all of the bodies are important, right? I mean, I wouldn't try to say one is, you know, more important. I mean, if you don't have your physical body intact, like it's not a very good container for your emotional or spiritual body. So I don't like to kind of like rate things in that way, but I do think that, I want to think what you were what was the last thing you asked me? Because
it was like, what are the things that influence the spiritual body? So forget the like ranking the different bodies in order of importance, right. But let's talk about the spiritual body and like what that really means. I mean, the word spiritual itself is kind of a weird word that there's big semantic problems there. Like, what does that word really mean? And it means very different things to different people.
Absolutely. We've ascribed a lot of organized religion and other things like that people can get very, we don't have good language around this. Yeah. You know, and I talk a lot about like, you know, the earth being sacred, but I don't mean that in like, you know, I don't mean that necessarily in a religious way, but just in the sense that it's precious and it's special and it's something that speaks to us in all those bodies. So I think in terms of like what can hurt our spiritual body, I could give you some examples, but I mean, I think like we know it, but we don't know how to talk about it. Like think about how you feel when you read the comments of trolls on the internet. Okay. I know this sounds like a weird thing to say, but like, stay with me a minute, because these are like,
and actually like, just real quick, we should define what trolls are. Maybe not everyone knows what that means. Maybe they think of little kind of things living under a bridge or something.
Right. The little men are not necessarily commenting on the internet, but you know, so people who, well, I'll let you say. You could say what trolls are.
Well, trolls are basically just somebody who's attacking you, like just for the sake of attacking you. If you put some kind of, you know, let's say me or you, Maya, we publish an article or a video or something, and a certain small percentage of people will just come and attack you just because they want to attack you and they want to provoke a response, and that's their thing. That's what they get off on, you know. So that's what a troll is, basically.
Right. So what you know, what it is, but I think a lot of people could even say, okay, I'm reading like the comments on I'm reading the comments of some article on the internet. It's like you feel weird. You feel unpleasant. You don't like the way people are talking because there's sort of no accountability, whatever. But let's say someone writes something, you know, I think what you wrote is stupid and, you know, you're a laughing stock and, you know, you think you understand science, but you know, you're just an idiot or whatever things. And like you experience that and then you turn around, right? You're feeling whatever you're feeling, and maybe like someone, your friend is there, or maybe your spouse is there, or maybe, right? Or maybe your kid is there, and you turn around and what do? Are you going to be like, oh, honey, I love you, you know? Are you going to be, right? I mean, or are you going to be like, why did you just put that, you know, you might have a lot of this kind of, you know, you're feeling something, which is not just a feeling, but it's basically like they've discharged certain kind of angry energy, which now you're holding. How do we discharge that energy, right? I mean, because these are things that then we hold on to. And when you see, let's say, like another example would be, you know, doctors, right? And a lot of doctors, there's a very high rate of suicide and depression and a lot of those kinds of things in physicians. And a big reason for that is because they're holding space for a lot of suffering, you know, and a lot of those kinds of like, but so we're holding a lot, but we don't really know how to discharge it. So
Yeah, actually, if I can interject one thing on that point, you know, I don't know if I ever talked to you about this, but I went through a PhD program in clinical psychology. I did my whole, you know, all the 3 years of coursework, and I finished it and then realized I didn't want to be a talk therapist. And actually, part of the reason that I didn't want to be a talk therapist, interestingly enough, is it's a very simple observation. In my professors in the PhD program, I noticed that so many of them had lines on their face that were the line, you know, the wrinkles that were the lines of sadness and suffering.
mm-hmm.
And part of, you know, being a psychologist is sitting across from someone and kind of entering that space and empathizing with them and feeling what they feel. You know, I mean, if you're a good psychologist, you're not just going to sit there cold, totally unempathetic, and not feeling any of what they're feeling. But I saw the lines in their face, and I just had this feeling in me that I didn't want to spend the next 30 years or 40 years of my life feeling all of that suffering in me too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I want those people to be helped, but for whatever reason, it didn't feel right to me to be in that role, helping people in that way. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that, like, so what, let's say the way my teacher might talk about it is, you know, because also it could be watching certain kinds of shows or movies, right?
Mm.
There are certain shows, I won't name them, that, like, you know, I maybe tried to watch on Netflix once or twice, and I felt like I don't feel good when I watch this.
Yeah.
You know? And when you know how to feel good, when you know, sort of like she talks about the vibrational energy of different things, and, you know, we could go there or not, but, you know, she talks about something being in the right vibration. So what I like to feel, and it's not that I'm afraid of suffering, obviously. I mean, you know, I'm a doctor and I see a lot of kids who suffer, and I'm okay with that, you know, holding space in that way and working with them because the kind of work that I do. But it's just about, so it's like we live in a culture where there's a lot of ways to be exposed to kind of negative feelings, we would call it. But you might, if we were talking to one of the indigenous medicine people I've spoken to, they might say you're feeling forces, negative forces, or you know, things that are kind of like entities, they might even say in certain cases. So it's a different paradigm, but it's one that I think we're going to have to develop some language around in our culture.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be, I mean, for you at least, what do you think it means to have a spiritual connection, or to be a spiritual person, or what does it mean to have spirituality in one's life?
I mean, the way I think about it is feeling kind of a sense of connection, I think, is actually probably like the simplest way to say it. And for me, you know, it's feeling a sense of connection with myself, which, but also feeling a sense of connection again with like the world around me. Like, you know, when I'm outside, I'm really feeling connected to plants and trees, and I'm in it. You know, people walk in the woods with me. It's like I become like a 5-year-old. You know, like I want to touch things. I like looking at things. I might take pictures of things. I might hug trees. I might talk to trees a little bit. You know, I'm still a neurologist. I'm still doing all the, you know, all the work that I do with my patients and helping my patients. And I read scientific articles and do all that as well. But this connection, I think, is what, and kind of having a sense of gratitude and reverence. And for me, it's about seeing the sacred in everyday life. I think that's really what being spiritual is.
Beautiful. Yeah. For me, speaking personally, it really revolves around connection with the natural world. Where I feel, I guess, the most spiritually connected is when I'm out in the ocean, or when I'm, you know, hiking in a canyon or rock climbing or something like that. Just being in nature, but not just being in it and kind of just observing it, but like engaging with it, like interacting with it. Mm-hmm. And there's something magical to me about that. And I think what's cool also is that we now have this, you know, kind of merging the worlds. We have this body of evidence that's emerging around like Shinrin Yoku and some of this other stuff, as far as we now have science to show that a lot of this stuff really does kind of amazing things in us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of people who are, you know, actually let's go to plant medicines. So one of the other big things that a lot of indigenous cultures are very into is plant medicines. And this word, plant medicines, has a lot of different meanings. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of plant medicines, but I know that you are very much a fan of plant medicine. So can you talk a bit about, I guess, what that term even means for people who are unfamiliar with it?
I think there are, you know, so I'll kind of talk about it the way I think about it. I mean, I think it's used in a lot of different ways, especially now. But, you know, when I'm talking about plant medicine, I'm talking about all the different ways that we interact with plants and experience healing in that relationship. So for me, plant medicine could be giving someone flowers, right? Because giving flowers is transformative. You are giving someone flowers usually because it could be because you want to make them happy. It could be because you love them and you want to express that feeling. It could be because they're grieving, right? I mean, there are many reasons we might, you know, celebration, right? All these different reasons that we give flowers to people, and it's to transform them. And so to me, that is a form of plant medicine. You know, we drink chamomile tea or dandelion root tea. These are things which are influencing our body, and plants are so complex that they influence our body actually in our physiology in many, many ways, just even if we're just talking on a physical level. So we have these different ways that we interact with plants, where we might, you know, experience something with them by handling them or being near them or ingesting them or taking, you know, tinctures or even pills. And I think, you know, then there's become this sort of new world of talking very openly about even things like cannabis, right? So now, like, medical marijuana has become really available. I'm like in such a shadow here, but you know, it's become really available, and we're seeing such amazing studies on it. So we're finding now that in areas where medical marijuana is available, deaths from addiction drop significantly. Mm. So there's, like, you know, this sort of idea of how plant medicine can actually potentially prevent the kinds of deaths that, you know, because I think a lot of people think of cannabis as being, you know, a bad drug, but in fact, you know, it's possible that it can actually rescue people from very damaging drugs and addictions.
What kind of other addictions are you talking about specifically? Alcoholism, or like hard drugs, heroin and cocaine and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about deaths from addiction, right? So I think what was being discussed, you know, in that paper are, like, you know, heroin overdose, or, you know, related to like meth, or, you know, different kinds of addiction, deaths from addiction. So it's preventing fatalities, I mean, which is which is incredible, not to mention also treating a lot of what we consider as untreatable, right, conditions, whether it be chronic pain, whether it be, relating to cancer, whether it be seizures that are not responding to, many, many different medications and pharmaceuticals. So now we're kind of learning, right, plant medicine is something a little different, even than we thought in terms of like herbal medicine, that it's sort of like, we have to open our minds a little bit, I guess is what I would say.
Mm.
And I think now there's been a real opening of, people talking about things like psilocybins, right? So from like magic mushrooms, and there's a lot of studies coming out now about that as well, where it's being used for addiction. It's being used for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's being used in severe anxiety, and actually is transformative. Being looked at in chronic pain. Again, all these different conditions where things that we've considered as drugs and have kind of been afraid of are now having all this science behind them as possible sort of instruments of healing if we approach it in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is one area that I personally I'm very passionate about, but I've never actually talked about it publicly because of basically what you're just describing, that so many people who haven't looked at the science, haven't had any experiences with these kinds of things, have this stigma around them that, oh, it's a drug, and this was part of the hippie revolution, and just, a bunch of people dropping acid and getting high at concerts and things like that, and jumping out of windows and doing stupid stuff. And that's the association that they have with these kinds of substances. And when you look, if you have the right kind of experience yourself, or you start digging into the science, and I've even seen there was a recent convention where a whole big group of scientists were getting together to discuss all this new scientific literature around all the different benefits of, psilocybin and various entheogens, psychedelics. And, the science is amazing. And so, sometimes they do studies like Roland Griffith's research, where they've done some research in people with, I think it was depression in at least one of the studies. And they've shown absolutely like huge effects from a single dose of psilocybin from magic mushrooms that lasted for months, and that people subjectively went back and rated and said it was one of the top 3 experiences of their life. And, things like that, if these same things were happening with a drug from a pharmaceutical company, these things would be hailed as miracle drugs, and everybody would be, these things would be rampant. They would be used all over the place and advocated by MDs.
But I want to say a couple things about that. I think we are living in a world filled with miracle drugs, which are plants. And there's a very specific reason we don't get to hear a lot about what they do. And it's because they can't be patented, and no one can make that much money off of them, because plants are really, as one of my herbal teachers, Tirona Lodog, always said, plants are the people's medicine. Herbal medicine is the people's medicine. That means we can make our own medicine. We don't need any other company or anyone else to do it. And plants, I present a lot about plants and obviously could talk on, but, the science behind even things like reishi mushroom is just profound. It's looked at for things like HIV and hepatitis C virus that are not easy to treat conditions, or herpes simplex. Like, really, it's has a profound effect on the mitochondria. All the things that they do, because their actions are they're complex, and their actions are so complex and wide ranging. I think, we do have all these miracle drugs, quote unquote. But I would also say about the dangerous part of it, because I think it's important that psychedelics, and also just, kind of what we call drugs in general, in native cultures, there's a huge amount of respect for these plants that are powerful plants. And the way I was taught is, that they're master plants, have these incredibly powerful properties, and you have to really go to them with respect and really reverence and gratitude, and asked to be in relationship with them. So I would just give an example, like the coca plant is still widely used in Ecuador and, you know, in kind of in that part of the world. It's stimulating, like to chew the leaf or make a tea from it. And it's actually incredible for altitude sickness. Some of the advice I got when I went to Ecuador was don't be afraid to use drink coca tea because it's very helpful. And I actually do get altitude sickness sometimes. So, you know, I did drink the coca tea and it was incredibly helpful. It was incredibly helpful. But then what's happened, right, is like, you know, we turned around and said, we want to turn this into a drug. We want to get like what we can get out of it. And instead of going to it in this kind of reverent way, where you ask to be in a relationship with it and show it respect, we sort of took it and used it. And these are master plants and they're very powerful. And if you don't go with them in relationship and in a respectful way, you know, the people I study with believe that these plants can destroy you.
Yeah, and on that note, I should mention that you know, the first time that I was invited to do a type of entheogenic experience, I had no experience with anything in that realm before, and my conception of what the experience would be like, I mean, my only reference for comparison was that I had smoked marijuana a few times, and so my kind of idea of what I was going to experience was that we'd all, you know, me and a bunch of other guys would sit around this bong and smoke some marijuana, and that we'd, you know, get euphoric and giggly and, you know, have some laughs, and that would be that. And I went in, and that experience was a DMT experience, which was a very powerful entheogen, and it kicked my butt. It absolutely was by far the most terrifying experience of my life. Also the most euphoric and one of the most enlightening experiences of my life, all kind of wrapped up into one. I mean, it was so terrifying that I slept for 13 hours, for about 13 hours a night for about 2 weeks following that experience, because my system was so drained from this insanely intense fear response. So these things are absolutely no joke. And if you don't approach them with reverence, and you don't approach them with the right attitude, and you don't do them in the right setting, yeah, they can teach you a lesson for sure. Not in a good way.
Well, it's you know, again, like the people I study with would say, it's you know, you get the medicine you need. So you don't want to need that kind of medicine.
Yeah.
better to go in with, and just because you go in with respect doesn't mean it won't kick your butt.
Right.
You know, if you need your butt kicked, you know, so these master plants are so powerful. You know, and here we could also talk about some of these other entheogens like ayahuasca or San Pedro, or, you know, some of the others that are, I think, becoming probably more popular now than they have been. And I think a lot of people do go in with this idea of like, ooh, I'm doing something interesting, and then they have their butt kicked.
For sure. And you know, one other thing that I think is worth mentioning here is there's this kind of idea around that, you know, doing a dose of ayahuasca, or having an ayahuasca experience, or a DMT experience, or maybe a mushroom experience, is like doing, you know, 10,000 hours of psychotherapy, you know, wrapped up in a few hour experience. And I certainly felt that way. And I was actually, you know, my first experiences, I've only done this a few times, but my first experiences were actually during my time in my PhD program for clinical psychology. So and part of that program was that you have to actually be seeing a therapist yourself, just as, you know, your own kind of personal hours of experiencing this profession. And so I was experiencing that. And then at the same time I had gone and done this, and I was like, there's no comparison here. I mean, I feel like I just had more benefit from this experience of this one night than I could possibly get from a decade, you know, of this kind of talk therapy.
But keeping in mind, though, that a decade of talk therapy all wrapped into 5 hours, you have to be ready. You have to be ready for that. You have to want that. You have to be ready to process that.
Right.
Many people will have an ayahuasca experience and, quit their job, leave their marriage. I mean, like, there's a healing process that may be going on that, like, is awakening, someone maybe to their higher self or their purpose or, what have you. But
it's not all sunshine and rainbows.
A little bit in the process. So, and I think I would also add the way it's prepared is important. The people that you're with are important. The person who, is holding space and really, kind of protecting the group is important. So all of these things it's not something I think to be taken lightly or to enter lightly, but the healing potential, and again, there is science to support this. There are more and more studies, even on things like ayahuasca. The science is profound in the kinds of healing that can occur.
Yeah, so I would love for you to talk more about that, because a lot of people listening to this maybe have severe chronic fatigue syndrome or maybe other conditions. Maybe they have hypothyroidism or severe depression, anxiety, that they've been dealing with for years, maybe even decades in some cases. And I would love to kind of help those people understand the potential role for these kind of entheogenic plant medicines, the potential role of those plant medicines that they could play in the healing from these conditions.
Yeah. Let me start by saying that, in my practice, I see patients from all over the world who have very often not gotten better with any number of, traditional means. They might have been to many different institutions, all the smart people out there. And after a lot of years of working with these kinds of patients, I sort of have a general sense of what works and what helps people and how quickly it happens. Everyone's individual, but there's sort of a pace that I'm used to. And what I started to see in my patients is that some of them really weren't getting better the way I expected that they could and should and normally would. And it seemed like there was something else happening. Now, I'm not sending children to take ayahuasca or anything like that. So I'll be just very clear about that. But what I started to see is, I knew that we were addressing the physical things. And I mean, obviously, there's always things I might miss, et cetera, but, I've been doing this long enough to kind of have a pretty good sense of that. And I would look at kind of the emotional life as well, but sometimes it's really looking at things on this kind of energetic level that really opened things up for these, not just children, but also I see adults that were chronically ill with all different kinds of conditions. So the idea behind using something like plant medicine in this way is that we don't have good treatments for sometimes the kinds of conditions that affect our spiritual or energetic body. But these plants can do that. That's from the standpoint of like maybe paradigm. And what we see is they really can help. And I don't think that it's for everyone at all. As I think we just discussed, you have to really be prepared to kind of enter something that might be very, you might be facing some of your deepest, darkest fears that you didn't even know you had.
Yeah, that was certainly the case for me, for sure. And yeah, I mean, caveat emptor, that there is a potential for tough experiences here. This is not all sunshine and rainbows. And I think
we're tough.
Yeah. And I think we should maybe, if you want to just talk a moment on maybe who this is contraindicated for, who shouldn't be going to do things like this.
I mean, there's a long list, but I will say kind of, the top is, people who have significant cardiac conditions. No. People who have, psychosis or a real propensity towards significant mental health issues. And that's a whole conversation, right? Because there are people with severe intractable depression who have recovered, using something like ayahuasca. But, people, especially who have hallucinations and things like that, it can be really contraindicated. People with seizures, again, contraindicated. Pregnancy, contraindicated. Trying to think what else is like just right off the top of my head. So, but we're ruling out a lot of people here, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And then just, I think, to go back to what you were saying earlier, just also not necessarily a medical condition, but if you just are maybe not the most introspective type that is necessarily looking to kind of dig into maybe some deeper layers of your personality, and you're not ready and willing and open to doing that work, maybe not the best fit also.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't even think it's about not being introspective. I mean, you could be introspective, but you cannot be ready. Like not everybody wants to face, and it could, an experience can be very different for different people. Oh, I forgot to mention, there's a lot of medications. If you're taking medications, there are many medications that are contraindicated, and some of them are antidepressants.
Yeah, like SSRIs for, the ayahuasca. Yeah.
Yeah. So that actually can be quite dangerous. So I just want to mention that. But, I don't think it's about being introspective or not, but just like if you're, you have to be kind of willing to really face things that could be really scary. And I know that, not everybody has a scary experience, but like many people do. I mean, many people also may vomit during the experience. And, a lot of people feel really anxious about that piece. But like, in my experience, I have vomited. And when people are like, oh, that sounds horrible, I'm like, that like is not even a memory I have or think about or worry about, because everything else was so much more intense, and I'm trying to think of even the word, but
it's like the intensity of those experiences. I mean, the intensity of the unpleasantness of vomiting versus the intensity of what you're experiencing when you actually enter that state. In my opinion, it's like 10,000-fold difference in terms of intensity. So it's like, oh, vomiting, like who cares? Like that was just a little thing that it's insignificant.
Right. Yeah.
So I have another question for you. It's a question that if I was being asked, I wouldn't know how the hell to answer it. So it's a tough one. I'm going to ask it to you anyway. Hopefully you have a better answer than I do. So there's going to be a subset of people listening to this podcast who have no experience with these kinds of things, who maybe came into this podcast thinking, oh, those are drugs, that, those are just like hippies dropping LSD, and, what possible benefit could I get from that? And I mean, you're just going to see a bunch of unicorns and, hallucinate all kinds of weird stuff. And how is that going to help me? Or what importance could that possibly have to my healing journey? And I guess my question is, for somebody who has no kind of conception of what an experience like this would be like, what actually happens? What happens when you have these kinds of experience? What's going on that actually is so beneficial or potentially beneficial?
This is like the $1 million question, really. Let's say we're talking about ayahuasca just as an example. And I would just say, many people will say about like ayahuasca that they speak about ayahuasca as a she. And they talk, ayahuasca is such a powerful experience, and many people will have experiences where they kind of can visualize in some way, her spirit or her entity in some way that, I mean, they talk about Mama Ayahuasca, and you'll look at a lot of like ayahuasca visions, artists who draw afterwards, and you'll see a woman, and also a lot of shamans will talk about ayahuasca in that way. So for one thing, what we were talking about before, these sort of energetic experiences that we have, where we experience suffering or we witness suffering or trauma or all these different things, that there's not a lot of good, we don't have a lot of language, and certainly not a lot of treatments to effectively address those experiences and what they do to us on an emotional level, on an energetic level, but also on a physical level. I mean, think about epigenetics, right? We know now that like suffering that our grandmother had, we are experiencing the aftermath of that through the way our genes are read.
Mm.
So we're experiencing ancestral traumas and stresses. We're experiencing our own traumas and stresses and suffering. There's a lot of just complexity to what's happening in our physical health. And we don't have a lot of language around it. But what we do know is that these plants, many cases plants, most cases plants, have some ability to help us release those things that we're holding that are causing us to be sick in some way. And in many cases, it's helpful to people who are physically very sick.
Mm.
So I think, like I would say in the simplest way, right, that this is about releasing what needs to be released from our kind of physical, emotional, and kind of spiritual or energetic body.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way of expressing it, and much better than I could have done with that question. On a personal note, I'll talk in very simple terms about some of the benefits that I got from some of my experiences. In some of my early experiences, I really had a lot of anxiety and tension just kind of constantly built up into me, even would manifest as physical tension and back pain, and like trouble breathing. And I discovered in one of my first experiences that this was related to kind of just not trusting, like a lack of trust in the world around me and the universe, that things were going to unfold in a beneficial way or in a nice way. And so I was constantly like on guard, like feeling like I have to control everything, worried about this potential thing and that potential thing. And that way of being oriented to the world was manifesting as all this just chronic anxiety and neuroticism and even physical pain in my body, as a result of that kind of mental orientation to the universe, and like whether or not I'm trusting how life will unfold for me or not. And that the first experience that I had was very much like, oh, I can trust. I can relax. I don't have to be on guard trying to control and like be the puppeteer of every moving piece of my life at every moment for fear that something is going to go terribly wrong at any second. And that it was a huge shift for me that massively decreased my anxiety and also manifested itself as better breathing. And I no longer had pain in my mid back, and like all these things that I'd suffered from for years just like basically went away. And it was miraculous. And so it's interesting to see, if hopefully I painted a picture of kind of some of these layers of the spiritual layer, the emotional layer, the physical layer, how they're kind of all intertwined there. But I think that gives people maybe one kind, potential type of example of the kinds of experiences one can have. And it's not just a simple intellectual thing like, oh, trust the universe. It's an experiential thing that you can only get from that kind of intensity of experience. It's like, wow, I get it now.
Yeah. And it might take days, weeks, months, for some people longer, to kind of get the full kind of understanding of what their experience really means and how it impacts them.
Beautiful. So I want to be respectful of your time here. I you might have to run here in a minute. Do you have to go here in 2 minutes here?
I have a few more minutes.
Okay. So I guess we'll end. Are there any final kind of guiding notes that you want to leave people with? I mean, I know that we've talked about some of the contraindications. We've talked a little about set and setting. Like, these are not necessarily things that you want to go out and like do as a party drug. And these are things that that should be done in a very sacred way with reverence in a setting that is for you to kind of have a more spiritual experience, not to like party and get high.
Yeah. And a safe experience.
Yeah.
As well.
So is there any kind of final thoughts you want to leave people with on this?
I mean, I think that what I would say using some of these master plants and getting and sort of having the most beneficial relationship with them really means that you have to prepare yourself. And that means, because there's a whole diet, actually, and they call it the dieta, which an actual particular, not just any diet, but a very particular way of avoiding certain kinds of foods, and some of them because they can actually influence the way you experience the plant, but also some of them to really prepare your body and to really walk into it in this kind of sacred mindset of you're entering something which is very healing, and it's with a very powerful plant spirit is the way that these communities will feel. So I think the kind of preparations are actually like asked to do no drugs, to really avoid pharmaceuticals. If it's not contraindicated and you need it, then obviously don't avoid that. But to avoid unnecessary pharmaceuticals, to come off of the pharmaceuticals that could actually interact, not to do any recreational drugs, and not to drink alcohol. That's part of how you prepare yourself from, and obviously the kinds of food and where you get your food, all of those things. And I would add spending time in nature, spending time in a contemplative way, really engaging and immersing yourself with the natural world. A lot of people will bring like an essential oil or some kind of, like flower essence or something, because, they want to kind of immerse themselves in plants and flowers, in order to kind of have a better experience. I don't necessarily think that works, but it's not, because it's not about better. I mean, it's about, you have to have the experience you have. But that's the advice I would give, is really both before and after, to also not to rush to do something of this nature, but to actually start with spending time with plants in general, and starting to have connections and relationships with plants that you grow or that are outside where you live, and starting with that kind of relationship. If you're taking an herb, know what that herb is. Try to have some connection with any plant that you're consuming, and or that you're using as medication in some way.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I hope that this podcast helped maybe at least some listeners kind of open up to some new ideas. I know some of this stuff, like connecting with nature and spirituality and plant medicines and entheogens, may be very foreign and out there for a lot of people listening. So I hope we've given you guys a sense of how beneficial these things can be in your life, and how important they can be to the healing process, and maybe opened up some people to exploring further. With all of that said, thank you so much, Maya. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I know that you have a 28-day cleanse coming up, I believe in January. Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Sure. So basically, this is just a way to kind of enter into the new year with an approach to kind of cleaning and supporting our physical body, the emotional, and the kind of energetic and spiritual. So people really, I think, have loved it in the past. And, this time we've added a lot of great additional stuff, meditations and other things, as well as kind of practical support.
So it's like 28 days to cleanse yourself nutritionally, physically, spiritually?
Yes.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Maya. It's been an absolute pleasure, and always love talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.